Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to a complete and detailed Lyney guide. In this video, we're going to be covering everything you need to know regarding how to best build and play Lyney. We're going to cover his best artifacts, weapons, teams, playstyles, rotation advice, and so much more. I get to give you guys all this information pretty much as early as possible because I had time to play Lyney on a media server before he came live. And so I'm going to go into as much detail as possible without wasting any of your time, talking about everything you need to know about Lyney. Before we begin though, as always, I do stream most nights on Twitch in case you guys are interested in catching me live. And with that being said, let's get right into it. All right, so starting things off, what does Lyney actually do and how are you supposed to play him? Well, the first thing you need to know is that Lyney is primarily a charge shotting character, a charge attacking bow user who has a unique charge shot that has levels to it, and at its max level, charge level 2, it will fire off a prop arrow which will deal a genuinely high amount of single target pyro damage while also having a lot of unique properties to it. In fact, when you do fire this level 2 charge shot, not only will this be Lyney's signature prop arrow that has a higher scaling than just a regular charge shot, but it will also consume some of your HP to give you damage. In fact, if your Lyney is above 60% HP, then he will consume 20% of his HP to gain a prop surplus stack. You can have up to 5 of these at once, and you can only gain them if you do consume some of your HP. So if you're higher than 60% HP, then you can get a stack just by shooting a charge shot. Do note though that you cannot gain a stack if you don't consume any of your HP, and you also cannot drop under 60% HP through this effect, which means that effectively if you have any amount more than 60% HP, you will gain a stack from charge shotting and also lose some of your health in the process. But if you're under 60%, then you can't gain any more stacks when you're charge shotting. These stacks will be consumed when Lyney uses his elemental skill, Bewildering Lights, where you do AoE power damage in front of you, which will scale off of how many stacks you have. It has a base damage and then will do more based on how many stacks you have, while also healing you back for basically how much HP you lost, so 20% per stack you have. So a pretty large amount of HP you're getting back, oftentimes being enough to fully heal you, assuming you do have a lot of stacks. More importantly than these stacks though, every single time you fire a charge shot with Lyney, you will effectively just get another free hit of pyro damage thanks to a Grin Malkin hat. In fact, anytime you charge shot, you will summon one of these hats. You can only have one out at any given time, and what it will do is first of all taunt opponents, attract their attacks, making your Lyney a bit safer, and can help you aim shot a bit more efficiently, while also and especially firing off a very strong hit of pyro single target damage called a pyrotechnic strike. This pyrotechnic strike is considered charge attack damage, meaning it will get buffed from a lot of the things that you're building on your Lyney and has a very high scaling. This is kind of similar to a Ganyu Bloom or a Ganyu charge shot and its Bloom, except with a bit of a higher scaling, but being much more single target. This pyrotechnic strike will be fired anytime a hat is destroyed or when its duration expires. And because you can only have one hat out at a time, while yes, it can get destroyed by enemies hitting it because it has a certain amount of HP, or by using your elemental skill, as if there's one on the field, it will do AoE power damage instead of its single target one. Generally speaking, any single time you charge attack on Lyney, since you can only have one hat out at a time, if there's none, you'll summon a new one, which will eventually deal that damage. And if you already have one on field, then it will destroy the old one and immediately fire off this pyrotechnic strike alongside your charge attack while also summoning a new one. This makes it to where after your first charge shot, you're effectively doing 2 hits per charge shot, and then that extra hat you have when you're done charge shotting will eventually explode or be destroyed from enemies or by using your elemental skill, which we already covered, but also has the additional effect of turning that single target pyrotechnic strike into AoE damage, meaning that in practice you typically want to use your elemental skill when you have a hat out and also have as many stacks as possible depending on how many charge stacks you do in a rotation. Also, your prop arrows will also at a certain interval do another hit of very small damage, but primarily doing Numa aligned pyro damage to enemies, which is something that is needed for one of the new enemy mechanics in Fontaine that I don't really want to spoil and also need to learn more about, but from my understanding this is important, so keep in mind that Lyney does proc this. And so Lyney definitely is a character whose charge shots are a main and central part of his kit, but we still have a lot of very important things to talk about. In fact, first of all, his elemental burst is a really unique one where you just turn into a cat with a hat in a hat, which I love, where you'll basically just be walking around marching on enemies, dealing 1 hit of pyro damage to any enemy you walk over or are close to, and then also having a huge hit of AoE pyro damage whenever this burst ends. Now you can either cancel this burst early and get this big hit basically instantly by just pressing Q and then pressing E, as your elemental skill button will be changed into a way to cancel this ult, or you can let it run for its full 3-second duration. Do note that inside of your burst, before it ends, you can only do 1 instance of pyro damage per enemy, so you don't want to be staying in it for too long unless there's like a lot of enemies you want to run over, or if you just want to be a cat. This ability has a 15-second cooldown with a 60 energy cost and will also summon you 1 hat and give you 1 prop surplus stack. Now for Lyney's passive talents, here's where things get interesting. First of all, his first ascension passive will basically just make your Grin Malkin hats that you get from charge shotting healing, do more damage, and give you a bit of energy if you did consume some HP when firing off a prop arrow, which is just a nice bonus to your hat's charge shot damage. Where Lyney really does specialize as a character though is his second passive talent that you get at Ascension 4, increasing your damage dealt by 60% when dealing damage to pyro affected opponents, while also increasing this damage buff by an additional 20% for each other pyro party member you have in your team, up to a maximum of 100% total increased damage. Because of this passive talent, you really do need to be mindful of how you're building a Lyney team, typically wanting to run him with at least one, but oftentimes two other pyro characters in order to give him 100% increased damage to opponents affected by pyro. On top of that, you want to make sure the pyro uptime on enemies is high, so you don't want to be running too many elements that will basically override your pyro or ruin your Lyney's bonus damage. For reference, while a lot of pyro characters want to be ran in Vaporize teams, Vaporize will increase your damage by 50% on top of whatever elemental mastery bonuses you're gaining, whereas this passive talent can give you 100% more, which is just insane. This makes it to where Lyney clearly will specialize in teams that focus around pyro and a mono pyro team, if you will, and so do be mindful of this when you're building a Lyney team in order to get the most value out of him. Lastly, before moving on, I do want to say that for your talent priority, you want to maximize your normal attacks, as this will increase your charge attack damage, being the greatest portion of your Lyney's damage, and then level your burst, and then lastly your skill. If you aren't using your burst every rotation though, then your skill can be more valuable or about as valuable, so keep that in mind. Both of these can vary in strength, with your charge attacks being the most important talent to level. Overall, Lyney is a very unique character who relies on having a mono pyro team for the optimal performance, having very powerful off-field supports to aid him, increase his damage, and help him in AoE situations. And while his charge attacks are mostly single target, I do want to say that in practice, his skill and his burst doing a lot of damage and also having supports like Kazuo or Xiangling can really make him feel good in AoE as well, and maybe a bit more of a quick swappy playstyle, but still, do keep in mind he does have some weaknesses like the single target focus, but also the restriction in teams and the fact that you do need to play around having a relatively low HP and defense total, almost needing or really wanting a shielder or some form of resistance to interruption, which we'll cover in the team section. But keep that in mind, as yeah, you can deal more damage without a shielder, but you will get interrupted a lot and won't be able to charge shot as much, and it can make playing him a living hell. Genuinely though, as a DPS, he does feel really strong. I know part of this is because his supports are so good, but even just his personal pyro damage with no reactions is really high, which makes it to where I am impressed with this character, despite him being a main DPS, which is something that inherently will have a bit less pull value than really flexible and strong supports. But nonetheless, it's a strong main DPS option if you like his playstyle. Acknowledge the fact that he is a charge shotter and does run mono pyro teams, which I know some people aren't fond of. So if you're not going to enjoy a main DPS's playstyle, don't pull for them, genuinely speaking. But if you do, then I want to say that Lyney is definitely strong enough to be worth it as a DPS, again, if you enjoy his playstyle. Do keep in mind though, and this is really important, that the current Abyss is just the worst thing ever for him, because he is someone who wants to be ran in a mostly pyro team with one or sometimes two supports of a different element, meaning that the current Abyss, where there are pyro shields in the first half, and then the second half you want Dendro and Electro if possible, is really just the worst place to show off Lyney. So you may get a bit less value in this rotation than in probably the next one, which can unfairly make Lyney feel worse than he actually is as a strong main DPS option. Alright, now with all that out of the way, how do you want to build your Lyney? Well, starting things off for your artifact sets, it's pretty straightforward in the sense that the new Maréchaussée Hunter set, which came alongside Fontaine, is a set made for a character like Lyney, and one that is his best in slot by a pretty significant margin. What this set does is give you 15% normal and charge attack damage on the 2-piece, which is great for not just your Lyney's charge attacks, but also the hats that you summon alongside of them. Where this set really becomes great though is the 4-piece, which will give you 12% crit rate when your current HP increases or decreases, with this effect stacking up to 3 times. Now, while each stack will only last for 5 seconds, if you can fully stack this will give you a total of 36% crit rate, which is absolutely insane. That is the equivalent of 72% crit damage, and it's just a ton of stats, assuming that you can make use of it and have good uptime on this 4-piece effect. For Lyney in particular, this set can be a lot easier to have good uptime on than other characters because of the fact that you will gain a stack anytime your HP effectively will change, and this can happen in many different ways. First of all, Lyney can consume his own HP when he charge attacks if he does have more than 60% HP. This means that at least your first 2 charge attacks, if you start at full health, will trigger this set, while also understanding the fact that you're basically always going to be running Lyney with a healer, with this healer in particular typically being Bennett, who we'll talk about in the team section, but is insane at giving you a bunch of attack, being a pyro character for your Lyney, and also instantly healing you when you're 70% HP or under, meaning that you'll always go back to over 60% HP, allowing you to consume more with your next charge shot, and also healing you, which each of those actions will give you a stack of this passive. Getting healed gives you a stack, but also consuming your own HP will give you one, and then you can also heal yourself with Lyney's skill, which will give you a stack, and you can can also take damage from enemies if you're not shielded, although that is less than ideal. And so overall, this set effect is just the best for Lyney. So if you play Lyney, go farm this set and try to build it for him, as it is definitely a set made for Fontaine characters, similarly to Emblem for someone like Raiden, or even Blizzard Strayer for someone like Ayaka. With that in mind, there are some other alternatives if you don't have this set yet, as it's brand new, so day one you won't have this set. So other sets can be viable in the meantime, like notably 4-piece Lava Walker for 35% damage against pyro enemies, 4-piece Bull-Eyed if you're shielded, 4-piece Wanderers for some charge attack damage as well, 4-piece Desert Pavilion, Reminiscence technically if you can get enough energy. Also, the Vermilion Hereafter set can also technically be a pretty strong option until you get Maréchaussée, as while it doesn't compare to his best in slot, it can actually give you quite a lot of attack, assuming you use your burst at the start of your rotation and are reducing your own HP thanks to your charge shots. Then you can get a lot of stats from this 4-piece, or just mix and matching any 2-piece sets that you have the best substats on. All right, now that we covered what artifact sets you want on Lyney, what stats are you looking for? Well, as with most hyper carries, Lyney will want crit rate, crit damage, and attack percent to maximize his personal damage. With that in mind though, Lyney is a character who gets a ton of crit rate from external sources, and who will also get quite a bit of attack if you're playing him optimally, running a team with other power characters like Bennett, who gives a ton of attack through his burst and also his supportive Noblesse Oblige set, on top of the Pyro Resonance and other external sources. Because of this, and also the fact that Lyney gains a lot of crit rate from ascending, he has a crit rate ascension stat, while also gaining up to 36% with the Maréchaussée 4-piece that we saw earlier, making it to where Lyney already starts with 60% crit rate just from the set and his ascension stat, and then you also may be running a weapon that gives you crit rate, so you basically can get just a ton of crit rate for free, meaning that while yes, it's still a great stat, especially if you don't have any on your weapon, then getting anywhere from 20 to 40% more crit rate is still great, but crit damage will oftentimes be what most people will need more of as the best stat for Lyney, alongside crit rate, attack percent, and a bit of energy recharge. And while it is viable to burst every other rotation, typically I do recommend bursting every rotation with Lyney, as it is a good burst, so try and get ER substats if you can, with the exact amount varying based on your team, but usually it's around 120 to 140 ER. Again, varying heavily, it can be a bit less, a bit more, but that's the good general range to go for, depending on how much energy your team can generate, and also if you have things like Favonius weapons. And Elemental Mastery is mostly a wasted substat, as you typically want to keep enemies pyro afflicted, so you're usually not proccing reactions with Lyney, and so unless you're playing some team where you are spamming reactions, typically don't worry about that, and just focus on going for your standard crit damage primarily, but also enough crit rate and attack percent, with maybe a bit of energy recharge. Because of this, for your main stats, you're looking for attack percent on your sands, pyro damage bonus on your goblet, and usually crit damage on your circlet. The main exceptions here are that, first of all, for your goblet, pyro damage is usually the best, especially when you factor in how much attack you're gaining from external sources if you play Lyney with Bennett. But on the off chance that you're not using Bennett in your Lyney team, despite him being free this patch, maybe your other team needs him or something, then attack percent can be more valuable, with it usually being a pretty similar option to a pyro goblet if you don't have that much attack. A bit worse overall, but definitely a viable alternative if you don't have a good pyro goblet. Lastly, for your circlet, while I do typically recommend crit damage for the reasons I mentioned earlier, crit rate can also be fine, and if you're running something like a crit damage weapon and need more crit rate, don't have enough on your substats, then a crit rate circlet can be perfectly strong as well, whatever helps you balance your crit ratio the most. And obviously, while I do highly recommend the 4-piece Maréchaussée set, as we talked about earlier, if you're not running that artifact set, obviously you'll be getting less crit rate, so you can look for more on your stats as well, but typically, to maximize your damage, just look for crit damage, crit rate, and attack, depending on what you need more of to balance your ratio. Alright, now moving on, let's talk about Lyney's best weapons. Lyney is a character with quite a few good weapon options, in the sense that on one hand, he can use most of the 5-star bows, but also he has a great 4-star free-to-play option that anyone can get and refine for free. Starting with the 5-star weapons though, his best in slot will be the first grade magic. This weapon is basically a bow of Homa, giving you a great amount of crit damage, a high base attack, while also increasing your charge attack damage and giving you some attack. In fact, for each party member you have of the same elemental type as the wielder, including the wielder themselves, you will gain some attack, which means that if you're running Lyney with 2 other pyro characters, you gain 48% attack, with the minimum being 16%. On top of that, you'll also gain some movement speed, but that's less relevant, making it overall just the best bow for your Lyney. Not too far behind though is the Aqua Simulacra, which isn't quite as good, but still is an amazing stat stick, giving you a ton of crit damage and a great effect increasing your damage. And since it's the other bow on the current weapon banner, if you want a good bow for your Lyney, both of these 5-stars are his 2 best options. Similarly, Thundering Pulse, if you have it, is also quite strong. The effect is a bit wasted on Lyney, but still a good option, being a bit behind his signature and Aqua. For the other 5-stars, the ones that give crit rate, I do want to say that while they can in theory be really good for Lyney, like Polar Star and Skyward Harp are quite strong weapons, the problem is that you might have too much crit rate. You might overcap, especially when you factor in his crit rate ascension, the 4-piece Maréchaussée, which gives you 60%, and then 33% on Polar Star, for example, already makes it to where you don't want any more crit rate, rate, so your artifacts can be a bit harder to build as you may just have over 100% crit rate. With that in mind, if you're not overcapping too much, then any of the crit rate bows are good as well, with Amo's bow also being a viable option, giving you attack and then an effect that will increase your charge attack damage for however long the travel time is. And this can also apply to your hat's shots, at least from my testing, although the travel time isn't too long, and it does vary based on the size of the enemy you're fighting, but overall it's a decent option, being usually a bit behind the crit ones. With that in mind, Lyney doesn't need a 5-star. Obviously the 5-stars are pretty good for him, they're great stat sticks, but he also has some decent 4-star options, like either of the battle pass ones, Verdescent Hunt, or the new one, with the new battle pass weapon Scion being a bit better, especially in single target situations, and also because it doesn't give you as much crit rate, so it can be easier to build around, whereas Verdescent Hunt gives you 27. With that in mind, Lyney has a great free-to-play option with the Prototype Crescent, which is a 4-star stat stick that gives you a ton of attack, not just on its stats, but also on its effect, assuming you can hit a charge shot on the weak point of an enemy. This is usually very easy to do, but keep in mind that some enemies don't have weak points, so it can vary in strength based on the content you're doing. Assuming you can proc this weapon's effect though, it can be even better than the battle pass options and one of, if not your best 4-star option overall, so a great accessible free-to-play option for Lyney that I highly recommend. Other options include Blackcliff Warbow and the new Song of Stillness, as both being good as well. With that in mind, I'm going to put a weapon ranking on screen now, but keep in mind that this varies based on a lot of things like your team, the content you're doing, your artifacts and substats, so use this mostly as a general ranking and not an exact one. Alright, now moving on, I want to cover some advanced tips and rotation advice to give for Lyney to really get the most value out of him. First of all, as I mentioned in the talent section, you can cancel your burst, and this is something that I typically recommend doing, as the vast majority of your burst damage will come from the big hit at the end, and then instantly canceling it is usually going to be optimal unless there's a nearby enemy you want to run up to and hit before canceling it. And so generally speaking, press Q to use your burst and then press E to cancel it immediately, and then you can go back to charge shotting or swap characters. Something to keep in mind, however, when you are trying to have a proper rotation on Lyney is that you typically want to apply all of your buffs before doing any significant part of your damage. This means using a character like Bennett and any other offensive supports you have, like for example an Anemo character, swirling Pyro with the Verdescent Venerer set, or even making sure your Zhongli shield is out, using all of your support characters before swapping into your Lyney, and then using all of those buffs to increase your charge attack damage, your skill damage, and also your burst damage. Do be mindful of how long your buff uptime is, as the Verdescent Venerer set will only last, for example, for 10 seconds, so you want to try to make sure to get as much damage as possible before this runs out. Because of this, what you typically want to do on Lyney is make sure to use your burst when you're buffed, and then also get as many buff charge shots as possible before using your skill at the end of your rotation. Because of this, you can either use your burst at the start or at the end of your rotation when swapping into Lyney. If you use it at the start, you can get more energy, but if you use it at the end, you buff it a bit more, as you can get the Maréchaussée set to proc and finish off enemies. Do keep in mind, you want to use your skill after having done multiple charge shots, as the more you do, the more stacks you get, and the more damage your skill will deal. Generally speaking, you can do 3 to 4 charge shots per rotation, with an example rotation being using a few charge shots at the start, then your burst and your skill before losing any buffs. Alright, next up, let's talk about Lyney's Constellations. First of all, I want to say that obviously this entire video was talking about a C0 Lyney primarily, being a great character who isn't dependent on his constellations, but if you want some, here's what they do and how good they are. First of all, Lyney's C1 will let you have 2 of your hats at once, 2 Grin Malkin hats on the field at the same time, while also summoning 2 of them and give you an extra stack of your prop surplus passive when you fire a prop arrow charge shot. This is really good, but it can only happen once every 15 seconds, which is usually once per rotation. So while it is nice, it generally only happens once per rotation, so it's not the biggest increase in damage, but it is a nice little bonus. For Lyney's C2, you will gain some crit damage the longer you're on field, 20% every 2 seconds, stacking up to 3 times for a maximum of 60%. This constellation is pretty nice, and it can make it to where you may especially want to use your burst near the end of your rotation to make sure that your big hit of damage is fully buffed with this constellation, and in general, it just gives you a nice amount of crit damage, 20 to 40 to 60%, which definitely adds up, especially if you are on Lyney for longer. Moving on, Lyney, as with every other character, has 2 constellations that increase his talent levels, but his C3 will actually increase his normal attack level instead of his skill or his burst, which is a first for any character ever. This means that your C3 will actually give you quite a bit more charge attack damage, allowing your normal attacks to be talent level 13, which is, as I said, a first. With that in mind, your C5 will give you burst talent levels, which is okay, but it's not nearly as important as his normal attacks. Moving on, your C4 will decrease the pyro resistance of enemies when you hit them with a charge attack, which for Lyney himself is pretty decent. It'll give you more damage, but where this constellation really does gain value is in a mono pyro team where you're typically going to be playing Lyney. If you have other sources of strong pyro damage, like for example Xiangling, then they will also deal quite a bit more damage as well, making this constellation gain some value. Lastly, Lyney C6 is obviously going to be his best for personal damage, as every time you fire a prop arrow, you will also fire your special pyrotechnic strike that will do 80% 50% of a pyrotechnic strike's original damage. This damage is considered charge attack damage and makes it to where your charge attacks deal almost twice as much damage, just a lot more, increasing your personal damage greatly, especially when you factor in all of the constellations that add up. All right, now with all that out of the way, let's now get into one of the most important sections, which is covering Lyney's best teams. Now, first of all, as you may have noticed, I want to take a second to appreciate the new party setup menu, as this actually looks sick, so shout out to Hoyo for that. But as far as Lyney's teams go, it's pretty straightforward. So generally speaking, you want to run Lyney, as I said, in a mono pyro team. The main reason for this is because there's a lot of other really strong pyro supports or other strong supports that can leave the pyro aura on enemies, which makes it to where you gain the insane amount of damage that Lyney's passive talent will give you, provided the enemies you're fighting are affected by pyro. Now, with that said, not every character in your team has to be pyro. In fact, usually you only want 2 or 3, typically 3, but either 2 or 3 pyro characters total, and then run another character of another element as the last slot. In fact, what a Lyney team will look like is generally running Lyney with Bennett, who's his best support for reasons I'll explain very shortly, and then running 2 flex options, one typically being a defensive option, a shielder or someone who can just kind of give you a form of defensive utility, resistance interruption, oftentimes just a shield, to allow you to spam charge shots without getting interrupted and being knocked around everywhere. Your last slot is typically going to be an offensive flex option. This can be another DPS character like xxalanchangxx, or it can be a offensive support, someone like Kazuha, who can buff your team thanks to just being an anemo character. Now, there's a lot more options and a lot of example teams you can use with Lyney, but before I give you guys some examples, I want to talk about Lyney's best synergies, characters he synergizes with, and explain why, so that you can know how to build the best Lyney team for you based on what characters you have available. So first things first, as I said, Bennett is his best support because, well, not only is Bennett one of, if not the best supports, but he also especially synergizes with Lyney, as is a pyro character contributing to Lyney's passive. He will give you a ton of attack through his burst and the Noblesse Oblige set, and the pyro resonance, which Lyney greatly needs as he gets a ton of damage percent, and to balance that, attack percent helps a lot, while also healing you all the time when you go under 70% HP, which is something that Lyney will always be doing, as he will consume his own HP with his charge attacks. If that wasn't enough, Bennett will also give you some pyro particles and buff the attack of your other party members as well, make him a great character to add on to your team. With that in mind, you typically still want another form of defensive utility, as I said, a shielder or someone to give you resistance to interruption, Zhongli being a great option who can also have the Archaic Petra set, or Tenacity of the Millith, but typically Petra, which will give you just more damage on top of his shield being very tanky and decreasing the resistance of enemies. There are also some pyro defensive options you can go, like for example Yanfei with her C4, Xinyan especially with her C2 for more uptime, or even and especially a character like Dea, who meta-wise hasn't been the greatest, but with Lyney can actually perform quite well. Like, yeah, her resistance interruption isn't that long, it's only 9 seconds, but if you time it in your rotation correctly, this can help your Lyney charge attack without getting interrupted for these 9 seconds, and you can actually get quite a bit of value from Dea, on top of her off-field damage and being able to run the Tenacity of the Millith set to help you out. She's also a pyro character, which contributes once again to your passive, making her perform a lot better here than in other teams. Regarding Thoma, you can technically use him, but you have to normal attack to like proc his shield and to buff it, and his rotation also doesn't fully line up with Lyney, so I don't recommend him as much, but he's still viable. And outside of pyro shields, you can use other options like Kirara, Layla, or even technically Baiju, as their elemental application won't typically interfere with the pyro uptime you'll have. Zhongli is typically going to be the most recommended option outside of a pyro character though, as he's just a great defensive option, very strong shield, and also a lot of resistance tread. For your last slot, this is typically going to be, again, if you want a third pyro character, it can be someone like xxalanchangxx for a ton of damage, or you may already have a third pyro with like a pyro shielder, so there's really a lot you can do. Anemo characters are great offensive options, typically the best alongside xxalanchangxx, as someone like Kazuha can give you a ton of damage percent thanks to his passive talents and the Verdescent Venerer set. Other Anemo options can just run the Verdescent Venerer set, and that's enough to make them super strong, as it will greatly increase your pyro damage from all of your pyro party members. Other Anemo options in Kazuha include characters like Sucrose, who can also run Thrilling Tales, or Hazo for pretty much the same reason, Venti if you want to group up enemies and also have a pretty strong amount of personal damage, but this is especially true against enemies that Venti can displace. Lastly, you can technically run Lynette, just because Lyney and Lynette are like kind of designed together, they look the same and they're like brother and sister, and it can work because Lynette can run the Verdescent Venerer set and a supportive sword if you have one, and Lynette does have a taunt which can sometimes act as a form of defensive utility, so she can have a bit of synergy there, but she still won't provide as much as the other Nemo options we mentioned, just something worth considering if you want to play them together. Overall, Lyney teams are pretty straightforward, I don't want to overcomplicate it. Typically you're running mono pyro, you can do Lyney, Bennett, and then double flex, usually a defensive option like Zhongli or Dea, and then an offensive option at the end. It could be another pyro character, it could be an Anemo one like Kazuha or Venti, or you could even use a shielder of another element and still get a lot of pyro. For some more niche options, as I said, you can still run Lyney with Lynette if you want to, even though it's not as recommended. You can still get some value there, or you can run some reactions provided they don't remove the pyro aura on enemies and you're not applying too much of another element. And while this can work, it typically is a lot stronger to just go mono pyro, as that is how Lyney is designed to be played. You want to run him in a team of 2 or 3 pyro characters with strong supports like Xiangling, Zhongli, Bennett, Kazuha, or even arguably Dea with him can be a viable option, with all of these variations being very strong, and my personal favorites being recommending either a triple pyro team with some form of defensive utility or a 2 pyro with Kazuha and Zhongli. With that in mind, I'm now going to get into a showcase of my Lyney in this team and in the current Abyss, and I do want to include the disclaimer here that, as I said, the current Abyss is absolutely terrible for Lyney, so just keep that in mind. Also worth noting that my Lyney is not on the Maréchaussée set because it's new and I don't have a good set yet, and that set can be like 15 to 20% more damage. It is really good, so keep in mind that the showcase here, even though I am very high investment, obviously my build, my artifacts on 2piece are amazing, and I have an R1 signature weapon, I am losing out on his signature set, which can make this a bit more relatable. And keep in mind that you can even do better than this Lyney, who is on 988 talents, C0, and level 80, with, as I said, a good ratio, albeit without his signature set. Hope the guide was helpful, and I hope you'll enjoy the showcase. Let's go. And so yeah, Fontaine is finally here, and along with it came Lyney, a character that I genuinely really do like as a main DPS, but you shouldn't feel forced to get him, obviously. Just a nice, viable, and honestly strong DPS option if you like his playstyle. I hope you guys enjoyed, and stay tuned for my Lynette and updated official guides coming out soon, right after this one. Thank you for always waiting for my guides. I hope the slight wait was worth it. And with that being said, I hope this helped, and as always, I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace. It's Lyney talk. It's no shield. Okay, there's no shield in the team. That's not his fault.